We're looking in our Bible study series at 1 Peter, and we've got to chapter 3. Remember, this is a book written to Christians who have had to leave their homes and their families and their friends. Because of persecution, they've been thrown out into the big wide world of the Roman Empire, and they're having to make their way there without the support that friends and relatives would give them. And as he's writing to them, Peter's encouraging them to trust God, to follow God, and to seek to know God better. And that's what we need to do. And in our day, with all that's going on around us, we need to do the same. Now, key to this work this week is the heading fear, and that's what I'm going to concentrate on. The word. All right, let's start looking at the text that we're going to consider today. He deals with three groups of people. Well, they kind of interchange in a way. The first section, he's dealing with wives. So he's dealing with the fears that wives have. Then the second section, he's dealing with the fear that husbands have. And then in the third section, he's dealing with fears that everyone has. Now remember, he's just said you have returned to the shepherd and overseer of your soul, and that should remove fear. But there are many reasons to be fearful, and he's going to start wrestling with some of them. Let me show you where the term fear appears. Do not be frightened at the end of verse 14, though they threaten you. Do not give way to fear, he says to wives. Do not give way to fear. And then he says to husbands in the same way. So there are things that he says to the wives that he doesn't directly say to the husbands, but they include the husbands as well. So fear is quite important here, and you can understand why people are fearful. But perfect love casts out fear, and we're called to be faithful to God, and we're called to trust God, and in our lives bring glory and honour to him. Let's look at this first section on wives. So the wives are called to submit to their husbands. Furthermore, as they submit to their husbands, they are like Sarah, who obeyed Abraham. And so there's a historical background to wives submitting to their husbands and trusting their husbands to watch over them and to help them and to remain faithful to them in a very hostile world. And a number of fears, it seems, arise in the hostile world and in the relationship. Let's consider what Paul says. He says, first of all, as you obey God, and of course you're a slave to God, we saw earlier on in the last chapter, as you obey God, your behaviour might win them over without words. So the first fear is that fear of a husband and wife, where the wife is a believer and the husband isn't, and there's obviously a conflict in that relationship, and the wife is in a most difficult position. Certainly in the ancient world, the wife would be expected to follow the religion of her husband, but that's not true in the Christian world. In the Christian faith, it's personal belief that is so key. And so there's this whole question, will he believe? And will he accept my different faith? Then he also says, your purity and your reverence will be obvious. And then he goes on to talk about beauty. Your beauty shouldn't be outward adornment. That doesn't mean you shouldn't seek to make yourself beautiful in a physical way, but he says rather the emphasis should be on the inner self, the unfading beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is of great worth in God's sight. So the second fear is that the husband will divorce her because she's not beautiful, or she's not as beautiful as she was, or he's found someone more beautiful. This is an issue that falls into the realm of marriage right through all time. But remember, God is saying, don't fear, trust me, and put the right things in place, because that's what God loves. Don't give way to fear. So let's look at this first section. We have the shepherd and overseer of our souls. We do not need to fear, but rather to entrust our fears to God. So what fears do wives have? Can they submit themselves to their husbands? Can they seek to adorn the inner self as a priority? Can they be gentle and quiet in spirit? Can they entrust themselves to their husbands? This is what God is challenging, and this is what God seeks. This kind of behavior and these principles and these desires. Now, God may use their lives as a witness to an unbelieving husband, and their lives will be of great worth in God's sight. Well, let's pause here and consider for a moment the pressures upon believing wives with believing husbands and believing wives with unbelieving husbands. Now we need to ask the question, what do husbands fear? Because they have this, that statement is there in the text, in the same way. In the same way. So husbands in the same way. So there are things that are true of wives that are true of husbands. And that's quite interesting, because you say there's an awful lot written about the women, but very little written about the men. Well, Peter is just not repeating himself. He doesn't need to repeat himself. He's already laid down principles that are true of husband and wife, of in fact anyone in a relationship. And so what sort of fears does a husband wrestle with? Well, the husband can also wrestle with having an unbelieving wife. And will she remain with him? And that's a big question, just as wives have the problem of unbelieving husbands. So that's a challenge. And what should a husband make himself handsome with? How should a husband remain appealing to his wife? And if you think that this is a modern problem, you need to really read up what Roman life was like. Should it be an outward adornment, or should it be the inner self, the unfading beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit that is of great worth in God's sight? You say, well, should that be a description of a man, a gentle and quiet spirit? Well, yes, later on, he's going to tell everyone that they need to be sympathetic and love one another and compassionate and humble. And so what's true of the wife is also true of the husband. But there are other things that are specific to the husbands. The husband has also to be considerate. Maybe that reflects something of the weakness of men, that they are inconsiderate. Be considerate. Treat them with respect. Recognize they are the weaker partner. Now, weaker here does not mean lesser. It just means different. Weaker here does not mean mentally weaker, but it certainly would include physically weaker. Now remember, Peter is writing to the Roman world, and it wasn't as nice and kind a world as the UK in 2020. It was a very hostile place, and it would have been very hostile to women. And actually, when you look at Jerusalem at the time of Jesus and the promised land at the time of Jesus, you see that it was a difficult place and a dangerous place for everyone, but also a very dangerous place for women as well. And certainly women who didn't have the protection of a husband. And you just, that story of the woman by the well comes to mind, and the woman who was caught in adultery come to mind. You know, where were their husbands? Where were the people who should have been watching over them and protecting them? So recognize that certainly physically and maybe politically in Peter's day, the women were not as powerful as the men and as influential. So the man had a great responsibility to take care of his wife and to watch over her. And then to recognize that you're equal in that you're heirs of the gracious gift of life. And then the husband had the responsibility to make sure that there was nothing that hindered the spiritual life of his wife or himself. That was his responsibility as well. And so you see again that there are a series of challenges and that could make a man very fearful. But as one who has entrusted themselves to the shepherd and overseer of his soul, a husband must not be careless or bullying towards his wife, but a husband must also not fear. He may win over his wife by his radiant purity of life, but he must seek radiant purity. He must concentrate on the qualities of the inner man, the unfading beauty, or for a man we call it handsomeness, of a gentle and quiet spirit that must be true of all people, all believers, not just women, and not just married men. He must not give way to fear. He must be considerate and respectful. He must give protection where it's needed. He must recognize, despite the differences, his spouse is an heir to life and equal with him. And he must live so as not to hinder the prayers of himself or his wife. There are some real great and deep challenges there. And we'll just pause there and think about these things. What fears do husbands have? Now, having dealt with wives, husbands, he now deals with everyone. Finally, this suffering for doing good is a title, not part of the text. Finally, everyone has to be like-minded. Like-minded what? Like-minded to Christ? Yeah, well, certainly that. Like-minded to men and women who are married? Yeah, certainly that, because that's what he breaks out into. Be like-minded, whether you're married or not. And you're to be sympathetic, you're to love one another, you're to be compassionate, you're to be humble, you're not to repay evil with evil or insult with insult, but repay evil with blessing. You were called that you may inherit a blessing. So everyone, no one breaks free of these principles. And even a single person or a widower or a widow, they're still bound by God to adorn the beauty of their hearts with gentleness and quiet spirit, that unfading beauty. They are also called to be gracious, to be merciful and to be kind, and not to repay evil with evil or insult with insult. I think a few of us have known marriages that have been like that. Well, that's not for a Christian to do. And so a Christian, whoever they are, must never break down their relationships into open warfare, but repay evil with blessing. This is why God called you, and this is what God has called you to do. In fact, Jesus makes it very clear, love your enemy. love your enemy. Finally, we have this lovely poem. Whoever would love life and see good days must keep their tongue from evil, their lips from deceitful speech. They must turn from evil and do good. They must seek peace and pursue it. The eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, the ears of the Lord attentive to their prayer. The face of the Lord is against those who do evil. Remember, whatever you do and wherever you are, if you're a child of God, God is watching you and he's watching over you, so you need not fear. You don't need to be frightened, even if you're threatened, for God is the shepherd and overseer of your soul. This is a good lesson for us to learn in these days, and one that's very challenging. So a pause. Everyone, married or not, have turned to the shepherd and overseer of their soul, but what fears do we share? Well, the fears that are common to man: fears of rejection, fears of disappointment, fears of abandonment. Well, we're to be sympathetic in the midst of it, compassionate, humble, not repaying evil or insult with the same, but repaying evil with blessing. This is what we're called to. We're not to be afraid. Why? Because the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, the ears of the Lord attentive to their prayer, and the face of the Lord set against those who do evil. Peter helps us greatly, doesn't he, as we wrestle with life today. Married or not, well, may God bless you as you meditate and consider his word.